Chapter 14 in our book is entitled Making Change, but my lecture is Lecture 10, Managing Change. Organizational change management can be defined as a method and framework for managing the course and effect of new business processes, changes in organizational structure, or cultural changes within an enterprise. It's all about the people side of change management. So when I think of profound and fundamental change, I think of companies that adopt TPS, the Toyota Production System, known here in the U.S. as lean transformation. Why do companies, and in particular manufacturing companies, go lean? The typical reason most companies go lean is because they have to. Much like that line in the movie The Hunt for Red October where Captain Ramius says, "When he reached the New World, Cortez burned his ships. As a result, his men were well motivated." A great movie, really, except that Russian subs' control rooms are not full of shiny chrome and mirrors, though it does look kind of cool. But the point here is most times companies are forced into making change. Change or die. Often companies are forced because of costs, and they look to lean manufacturing as a great way to reduce many of the costs incurred during manufacturing processes. Overhead is reduced because you shed staff. Inventory costs are also reduced. Cost isn't solely the only reason, but companies cannot deny this advantage of lean. It cuts waste, and eliminating wastes eliminate costs. And while companies lean themselves, they typically simultaneously also improve safety, quality, and delivery. In fact, I'll tell you this, the best companies engage in lean to improve safety, quality, and delivery, and in doing so, they ultimately improve productivity and reduce costs. But most companies have to be beaten into lean. Be lean or the ship sinks. And despite many companies' best efforts, the track record for successful lean implementation is not great. Some recent studies reveal that lean failure rates for lean transformations range between 50% and as high as 90%. And while I've led and run successful lean transformations, and this is not a class on lean nor lean transformation, neither our book nor I am going to go into the direct countermeasures in supporting lean. What I do want to cover are some concepts in managing change. As a leader, you will need to be able to articulate the vision as to why, remember command intent, and then manage successfully the change. Recall from our leadership lecture, leadership is all about change, and the first person who must accept that change is the leader, and plans change. We see here the usual and typical graph of change. Our book outlines this on page 501 and calls this graph punctuated equilibrium. The idea is that as time progresses, stuff happens. We can call them shocks to the system. They can be external to our enterprise, such as disruptive technologies, maybe massive market shifts, recessions, that sort of thing, right? Or they can be internally wrought. Lean transformation Kaizen bursts are a really good example. So, let's say you are planning and playing your change by the book, so to speak, and you are in our blue ellipse that I've labeled Chapter 14. You've outlined it for the team with Lewin's force field analysis. You've structured your change as a series of changes that you've creatively titled Kaizen bursts. You have carefully structured your communications around Kotter's 8 stages of change and have properly structured the change as a series of problems to be solved. In essence, you have drawn your map. You have your folks aligned to achieve some higher level of performance and are taking your team to where no team has gone before. Great! There's this quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. And it goes something like this. Every battle is going to surprise you. No plan ever survives contact with the enemy. And while you have nobody shooting at you, your well-crafted plan just fell down and went boom. Okay, so now what? There's a classic leadership business case revolving around a fellow by the name of Ernest Shackleton. The Shackleton expedition launched in 1914 and ended in 1916, and it's a compelling story of leadership when disaster strikes. Essentially, when plans fall down and go boom, again and again. Nancy Cohen, in her article, Leadership Lessons from the Shackleton Expedition, offers what I was speaking about regarding external impacts. She mentions the financial crisis of 2008, the Gulf oil spill of 2010, the tsunami and subsequent Japanese nuclear disaster in Fukushima. Her thesis is this: constant turbulence seems to be the new normal, and effective leadership is crucial in containing it. She uses the Shackleton story as a framework to explain her thesis. Margot Morell and Stephanie Caprell's Shackleton's Way, Leadership Lessons from the Great Antarctic Explorer, Viking Books 2001, also use Shackleton as well to highlight lessons learned from Shackleton's mission. And they list the lessons, and here are a few. Cultivate a sense of compassion and responsibility for others. In a rapidly changing world, be willing to venture in new directions to seize new opportunities and learn new skills. Find a way to turn setbacks and failures to your advantage. Be bold in vision and careful in planning. Learn from past mistakes, yours and those made by others. All right, now, nothing earth-shattering with any of those, right? But there are a couple others they also list. Right, I want to mention these. I want to focus on these. First one is, never insist on reaching a goal at any cost. And secondly, don't be afraid to change your mind when you see your plan isn't working. The reason I like to focus on these is because these are particular to human nature and the management of behavior of the leader. First, we can become very task-oriented when we move from one task to the next. However, while the manager in us likes the idea of climbing the ladder rung by rung, the leader in us cannot afford to be so myopic, such that we forget to check if the ladder is still on the correct wall. We can forget that we are in a dynamic, open system, which means stuff happens. Second, recall our Cali-bound flight crew, our pilots, and how confirmation bias in the cockpit doomed the plane. The team was closed to new information and unable to see that their plan wasn't working. All they saw were their perceived successes and not the impending failure. Before I go further, let me give you a Cliff Notes version of the Shackleton story. We're going to follow Nancy Cohen's story in the New York Times article I mentioned earlier. Okay, so Shackleton and his crew on the Endurance set sail in August 1914. They had a bold, potentially history-making goal. Shackleton and his team would be the first to walk across the Antarctic continent, starting from the coast of the Weddell Sea, traversing the South Pole, and ending up at the Ross Sea. But from the beginning, the expedition encountered unfamiliar challenges. First, before he and his crew even departed, there was talk that the group had underestimated the gear and provisions needed to undertake such a trip. Okay, so they set sail. 1914, the ship arrives at a whaling settlement on the South Georgia Island, the last southern port of call before the Antarctic Circle. Now, local seamen had urged Shackleton to postpone his venture because of unusually thick pack ice that could trap the ship if the wind and temperatures shifted suddenly. Do you already hear those 2 points I picked out on the previous slide echoing in your ears? If not, well then hear this. Never insist on reaching a goal at any cost, and don't be afraid to change your mind when you see your plan isn't working. But, impatient to get moving, Shackleton commanded the ship to continue south, navigating through the icy jigsaw puzzle of the Weddell Sea. All right, January 1915. The Endurance comes within sight of the Antarctic mainland, but harsh winds and cold temperatures descend quickly upon the ship, and the pack ice traps the ship, just as the South Georgia seamen had warned. The Endurance was immobilized, held hostage to the drifting ice floes. Shackleton realizes this, and his men would have to wait out the coming winter in the ship's cramped quarters until summer's thaw. Nice, huh? All right, so Shackleton fears the potential effects of idleness for his men more than he does the ice and cold. So, he requires that each man maintain his ordinary duties as closely as possible. Sailors swabbed decks. Scientists collected specimens from the ice. Others were assigned to hunt for seals and penguins when fresh meat was required, a protection against scurvy. But the goal was unwavering. His goal was unwavering, and that was to walk across Antarctica. Only his plan was delayed. Okay, days become weeks, weeks become months, and the ice is still holding the ship. By June 1915, the thick of winter in the southern hemisphere, the ship's timbers were weakening under the pressure created by the ice, and in October, water began to pour into the Endurance. So Shackleton orders his crew to abandon the sinking ship, and they make camp on the ice. Next morning, he announces a new goal. The ship's stores have gone. We're going to go home. Now think about this for a moment. From June to October, 5 months. He waited 5 months for what was eventually going to be inevitable. The local seamen had warned him about, and the history was clear. Rarely wooden ships of that time survived the crushing ice floes. Even ships like the Endurance, built to ensure maximum survivability with joints cross-braced for maximum strength, she simply wasn't fortified enough to survive the entrapment. But it wasn't until the ship actually began to take on water and sink that it became clear to Shackleton that maybe, just maybe, he needed to change his plans. Here's a Stephen Covey quote from one of the earlier lectures. Management is efficiency in climbing the ladder of success. Leadership determines whether the ladder is leaning against the correct wall. And you've heard me say this now too a couple times. Leadership is all about change, and the first person who must face that change is the leader. Bottom line here is this. You, as the leader, have to be willing to embrace change. Now, Shackleton made mistakes, and there is plenty of grist for the mill regarding his behavior, even after the Endurance was trapped. Once he relinquished his first mission to walk across Antarctica and embraced the second to bring all 28 men home safely, his leadership became much more effective. Now, I'll let you read the rest of the story for yourself. I don't want to spoil the ending. The questions I now wish to pose are, how do you know when it's time to hit the change of plan button? How do you know when your plan has fallen and gone boom? Are there warning signs, and how do you see them? How do you know you don't have blinders on? We've spoken about management by walking around before. It's key in observing behavior and results over time. It also gives you the chance to view firsthand the value stream and capture input and feedback from subsequent processes and the people associated with those processes. So, how do you observe behavior and results over time? Well, you keep score. What you see here is one method of helping you keep score to guide your management by walking around. And it's called a bowler. It's called a bowler because, well, it sort of looks like a scorecard you might see at a bowling alley. Bowlers clearly annotate the goals in hard numbers with real units. They also clearly let you know what winning looks like, you and your team, and then you can see trend of winning or losing over time. Properly constructed bowlers contain typically the following. One or more metrics, like productivity in terms of parts per person per hour, or maybe first pass yield, or our case here, changeover time in seconds. It establishes a baseline or jumping off point, it's called the JOP, for each metric. Our JOP here was at the beginning of the Kaizen event. It was 1,480 seconds for a changeover. It ties the metric to a time-bound target. Post-Kaizen required to achieve 300 seconds and maintain it. And it interpolates the time-bound targets, the plan, between the jump-off point and the final target. Now, you could be looking at it weekly or monthly, or in this case, it's the turn of the setup wheel. With this, you can easily and visually compare time-bound performance, plan versus actual, and highlight when a time period meets or beats the plan, shaded in green, or doesn't meet the plan, shaded in red. There are no yellows. There's no almost. Well, we were like 2% off. No, you either got the plan or you didn't get the plan. Red, green. The bowler presented here is a post-Kaizen event bowler from a single-minute exchange of dies, SMED Kaizen. One cell was involved in the SMED that produces 5 parts on the setup wheel. So how are we doing? Well, some wins and some losses, right? Is it clear? Well, yes. Does the team know what winning looks like? Yes. As the leader manager, do you have the ability to dig deeper, to ask questions, and to observe and orient yourself as to the situation? Yep. Can you make decisions based on the data presented? Well, most likely, or at least you know how to act and what steps to take next. Your book on page 513 outlines another method known as a balanced scorecard, and it's a little softer in terms of results and data than a bowler, but many companies do use balanced scorecards. So, keep these words you just heard me say in your head for a moment. Observing and orienting yourself as to the situation. Making decision based upon the data presented. Knowing how to act and what steps to take. Observe, orient, decide, act. OODA. OODA for short. O. Observe the behavior. Next O. Orient yourself to the unfolding events. D. Decide on the best possible course of action. And A. Act upon it. OODA. So there's a decision cycle known as the Boyd cycle, or the OODA loop, and it's become an important concept in business and the military. According to Colonel John Boyd, decision-making occurs in a cycle of observe, orient, decide, act loops. Any entity, either an individual or an organization that can process this cycle quickly can get inside the opponent's decision cycle and gain a military or business advantage. It can also help you as a leader be actively engaged. Colonel Boyd originally developed this process to explain to new fighter pilots how to direct their own energies to defeat their enemies and find survival for themselves. Boyd emphasized that the loop is actually a set of interacting loops that are kept in continuous operation during combat. He also said that the phase of the battle has an important bearing on the ideal allocation of one's individual energies. So, consider a fighter pilot being scrambled to shoot down an invading aircraft. The pilot has, like 1,000 things going on inside his or her head. But once the aircraft is in the air, the goal is to locate and neutralize the enemy. Now, if a pilot's opponent is any good, at all, really, he or she is going through the same cycle. One of Colonel Boyd's primary insights in fighter combat is that it was more important to be able to change speed, change direction, change altitude, and do it more rapidly than one's opponent, rather than simply being able to fly faster. Despite the Soviet-made MiG-15's superior capabilities in turning, climbing, and acceleration by the book numbers, right? American pilots shot down 10 MiGs for every F-86 lost. Now, the Americans achieved this impressive kill ratio by adjusting their aerial tactics, to exploit 2 key advantages that the F-86 enjoyed over the MiG-15: visibility and responsiveness. First, the F-86 bubble canopy afforded its pilot an unobstructed view of nearly every direction, whereas the MiG-15's canopy sacrificed the pilot's field of vision for superior aerodynamics and performance. Secondly, the F-86 had fully powered flight controls, which were highly sensitive to the pilot's inputs, required far less physical and mental exertion during aerial maneuvers than the MiG-15 that had these hydraulically boosted mechanical contraptions, right? Therefore, the F-86 pilot had faster execution of sequence of operations as the combat unfolded. So, it is better to be able to react sooner and turn faster than your opponent can turn, and therefore to be able to get behind him, or to be able to decelerate so rapidly that the opponent cannot follow suit and therefore runs out in front of you. And that's one of the meaning of the phrase, getting inside of your opponent's OODA loop. The same is true of metrics and bowlers, believe it or not, right? Visibility, responsiveness, and here's the deal. Many companies have this stuff posted. It's out there, it's visible, but people are not responsive to it. They don't act. They have the visibility, yet they don't respond. Their OODA loop is simply too big. Okay, gang, one last slide here. The top portion of this slide you've seen already. In fact, you saw it the first night in class. It was when I said that to truly manage organizational behavior, it takes grit. It takes grit to dig for facts and to be data-based. It takes grit to manage based upon the evidence. It takes grit to day in, day out, seek visibility, and to act, to respond to what you see. Now, I've included one last little bit here from the U.S. Army Leadership Manual, and it's part of a larger concept known as the Soldier's Creed. Now, I have this with me always. I actually have a little card of it. I have it. It's in my Franklin Planner, and I refer to it often. It helps keep me grounded when I encounter difficulty, especially when the difficulty is interpersonal in nature. Organizational behavior management is all about interpersonal relationships, and let's face facts, sometimes they become difficult. Some situations and some folks, man, they could just rub you the wrong way and really chap your butt. This helps me climb past whatever negative emotions I'm feeling. It helps me allocate my individual energies and helps me focus my emotional capital in a positive and passionate direction. For me, it is grit defined. And so now I leave you with a portion of the Soldier's Creed. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I am disciplined, physically and mentally tough. Well, it's happened again. You've gotten through another lecture, Lecture 10. Wow, Lecture 10. Man, okay. Here's the Lecture 10, call to action. No plan survives contact with the enemy. This is when your change management plan falls and goes boom, right? While Shackleton's mission highlights many lessons learned, some of them were cultivate a sense of compassion and responsibility for others. In a rapidly changing world, be willing to venture in new directions and to seize new opportunities and learn new skills. Find a way to turn setbacks and failures to your advantage. Be bold in vision and careful in planning, and learn from past mistakes of yours and others. But for me, the two most fundamental in terms of managing change were never insist on reaching a goal at any cost, and don't be afraid to change your mind when you see your plan isn't working. Remember the Stephen Covey quote, management efficiency is climbing the ladder of success. Leadership determines whether the ladder is leaning against the correct wall. So don't get so busy climbing the ladder that you forget to ask if it's still on the right wall. And remember too that leadership is all about change, and the first person who must face that change is the leader. Bottom line here is you, as the leader, have to be willing to embrace change. And remember, you're operating in an open and dynamic environment. Things are going to change. Employ management by walking around and keep score and make it visible so your team knows what winning looks like. Observe the behavior. Orient yourself to unfolding events. Decide on the best possible course of action and act upon it. Tighten your OODA loop. And finally, managing organizational behavior truly does take grit.